Hello, this is Dr. Chen, and this is the lecture video for Chapter 9, talking about multiple choice items. So, how is this topic divided into? First of all, we're going to talk about guidelines for writing out multiple choice items. We'll talk about advantages of multiple choice items and then disadvantages. Get rid of these things. Um, Oops. And then we'll talk about item analysis, and specifically we talk about how to calculate the discrimination index and the difficulty index, as well as the relationship between these two indices. Um, One of the first assignments for the third quarterly assignment is going to involve calculating the discrimination and difficulty index and providing the appropriate interpretations for both types of ways of describing how well your item or your multiple choice item is actually working. So, benefits of multiple choice items. Um, well, why do we do it, I guess? Well, multiple choice items are the ones that you see most of the times in achievement tests. Maybe a test that's designed to measure an area of knowledge such as introductory chemistry, biology. Just name any type of college course, for example, or even the SATs. Multiple choice items are easy to score, easy to analyze, fairly easy to tie to learning outcomes, um, and they're basically very flexible in terms of what level you would want to define the question. Your textbook talks about how you can write a multiple choice item at any level of Bloom taxonomy. And it is covered in chapter 14 in the textbook, but we won't be talking about that in this course. But suffice to say, what it is basically a systematic way of thinking about different levels of processing. From ranging from the least sophisticated levels of processing, such as assessing one's knowledge, to more sophisticated levels of processing, such as synthesis and evaluation. And so basically, that's just testament to how flexible you can make your multiple choice items be in terms of what level of processing you would want to assess. And so these are just some of the benefits of doing multiple choice items. It's easy to score, easy to analyze, very flexible, such that you could write it at any level of Bloom taxonomy, and also to match learning outcomes. So, what makes up a multiple choice item? Well, a multiple choice item, and this is an example of a multiple choice item. So, a multiple choice item consists of two major parts. Number one is a stem. So, this is important, really important for you to know, especially for the exam. What is a stem? Well, the stem sets the premise for the question and comes before any of the alternatives appear. The set of alternatives could be a sentence or part of a sentence that is basically used to complete the stem or answer the question that is being asked in the stem. So, for example, responses A through D are alternatives. There is only one correct alternative, which in this example it is B, response choice B. This correct alternative is sometimes called a key or key alternative. Other relevant concepts would be distractors. So, what are distractors? Well, distractors are basically going to be the ones that are labeled here as red or circled in this red line over here. Distractors are a special type of alternative. These are incorrect alternatives whose job is essentially to distract the test taker into thinking that the incorrect alternative is correct, but not to be so distracting that if the test taker knew the correct answer, that he or she wouldn't be able to identify the key. So the best distractors are ones that are plausible but never correct in the most basic type of multiple choice question. So these are important concepts to remember. The function of the stem, um, the alternative name for the correct alternative, which is also known as a key, as well as what are distractors and what are they trying to do. So there are 9 guidelines to consider when writing multiple choice items. In practice, most test developers try to adhere to most of these guidelines, but a test is not necessarily invalidated if it doesn't meet all of these 9 guidelines. For the purposes of the exam, you should know how following most of these guidelines does a pretty good job of predicting how well an item discriminates among people who know the material versus those who don't know the material, because that's basically what you're trying to do. So if the exam question asks why a multiple choice item fails to discriminate amongst people who know the content and people who don't know the content, you should probably be thinking about how one of these guidelines might have been violated. So the first guideline is you want to list the alternatives on separate lines and one right after the other. So page 154 in your textbook nicely illustrates how to do this and how not to do this. So I'm going to refer you to that for the example. Second guideline is you want to be sure that each item reflects a clearly defined learning outcome. This helps keep your question focused and concise as an evaluation tool. No, the key here is to be sure that your defined learning objective is reflected in the item that you are writing. Third, when possible, you want to try to include negatives, and so try to not include negatives in the stem or alternatives. Honestly, for this one, I kind of go back and forth because I do use negatives sometimes to differentiate between those who are paying attention versus those who are not paying attention when they're doing the exam. So, which I do think, being able to pay attention to detail is part of what I'm trying to indirectly assess through my questions. The worst, in my opinion, in regards to negatives is when there is a double negative. That is just unnecessary altogether. But obviously, Salkind doesn't recommend negatives. I cannot go back and forth on this. Fourth, as best as possible, you want to spread out the correct alternative across the alternative choices. So you don't want your correct answer to always be, say, response choice B all the time, or response choice C or D all the time. You want to spread it out so that the right answer can appear at any one of those response choices, A, B, C, D, or E. This helps guard against someone who may maybe just out of pure laziness just pick the same response choice again and again. Although most people, I imagine, probably try to Christmas tree it and just try to luck at guessing most of it. At that point, their chances of getting correct for a 5 response choice item versus a 4 response choice item would be 20% and 25% respectively. We'll talk more about that in the next couple of slides about the chances of guessing something even though you don't know the answer. The fifth guideline is to use correct grammar and to be consistent. This may sound like a no-brainer, but many multiple choice items are pretty poorly constructed in such a way that the test taker can easily figure out what the correct answer is just based on grammar. So maybe where the article A, so the letter A versus N, for example, A versus A, and is followed by a vowel such as I or E or A. So you definitely don't want to give unnecessary clues because that's just gonna up the chances of someone being able to guess the answer just based on context. All right. So the sixth guideline is that the stem of the item should be self-contained, meaning all of the information that you need to pick the right key should be in the stem. And the stem should also be written in clear and precise language. So everything that the test taker needs to know about the question's topic should be contained in the stem so that the test taker doesn't have to read redundant information again and again in each of the alternatives. Seventh is to try to avoid, I guess, again, it's coming back again to negatives. Negatives, absolutes, and qualifiers. So we talked about negatives already and what I think about that. Absolutes refer to using words such as never or always because in reality, there really is an absolute in case of anything. And qualifiers are using words such as, perhaps, although, or appears. Those are just words that make the question more vague than it needs to be. So you want to be confident, basically, in stating your claim when you're making the stems. Eighth, the eighth guideline is to be absolutely sure that distractors are plausible. If a distractor is not does not even seem logically possible, it's very easy to eliminate that. And then the value of that item in terms of being able to discriminate between those who know the content and those who don't know the content, well, the value of that goes down in terms of discrimination because the likelihood of guessing correctly increases substantially. And at ninth, items should be independent of one another, if at all possible. Sometimes, especially if it's a potentially difficult subject, such as maybe this topic or like other topics, such as psychometrics or statistics, I do try to make it a little bit easier. But if you do want to make it harder, you definitely want your multiple choice items to stand alone so that the answer of one item doesn't inform the test taker as to what the correct answer might be on another item. So ideally, you want your items to be independent of one another. So why choose multiple choice items? Well, there are 6 reasons to consider. First, they can be used to measure learning outcomes at almost any level of instruction. This allows the multiple choice items to be very flexible and useful anytime you're sure that test takers can read and understand the content of the question. So, very good in regards to that. Second, most multiple choice items are clear and straightforward. Typically, there's less ambiguity in answering multiple choice items compared to, say, essay questions. Third, not very much writing is needed, so this eliminates any differences between test takers based on their writing abilities, since you may not be interested in that, and also allows the responses to be completed fairly expediently. Fourth, the effects of guessing is less compared to a true-false item. So with 4 or 5 options, the likelihood of getting a well-written item correct by chance alone is anywhere between 20% to 25%, depending on if you go with 4 or 5 options. Fifth, if your items are easy to score, then, well, sorry, what I meant to say was multiple choice items are fairly easy to score for the most part, and it's typically pretty reliable. In the case of the quizzes for this class, for example, the Moodle website automatically grades and tabulates the score for me as an instructor so that I can focus on other things such as preparing the slides, answering student emails, calls, and all of that. 6, multiple choice items lend themselves to item analysis pretty well. And we'll talk about item analysis shortly, including how to do it and what it achieves. For now, it's enough for you to understand that this technique allows you to further refine your items so that they can perform better. And it's an iterative process. Every time you administer a set of quiz items or multiple choice items, you can always look back to see how it performed based on certain indices. Now, those are great advantages, but there are downsides as well. Guessing, for example, does have an impact or an influence on a test taker's score, which is why we'd probably want to consider some kind of correction for guessing. So remember that, the standard, for example, for alternative multiple choice item already provides a probability that you can get it correct 1 out of 4 times by chance alone, even if you don't know the content. So about 25%. So we should try to maybe even the playing field and get a more accurate picture of what's going on, taking into account random guesses. So the correction of guesses or guessing looks like this, where R equals the number of correct response the test taker had, W is the number of wrong responses the test taker had, and N, lowercase n, is the number of choices for each item. So for example, on a, say, 60 item multiple choice test where the multiple choice items have 4 alternatives, you can expect a score of 15 out of 60 by chance alone. So getting 15 questions correct out of 60 questions. So that's about 0.25 times 60. So if you get 15, so let's say, for example, a student named Russ gets 15 correct on this 60 item test. How can we adjust the score such that his performance is gently punished for lots of guessing? Well, When we correct his raw score of 15 out of 60 with the formula shown here, we basically take 15, which is R, minus number of wrong responses is going to be 60 minus 15, which will be 45, divided by, there are 4 number of choices for each item, so 4 minus 1 equals 3. So 15 minus 45 divided by 3 equals to 0, essentially. So quite clearly, his score of 15 doesn't really mean anything, because you could easily get 15 correct answers just based on chance alone. So this is one way for you to make a correction for guessing when trying to interpret the raw scores. So what are other reasons why multiple choice items are not so good? Well, for one, multiple choice items can take a long time to write. You can take anywhere between 10 to 20 minutes to write one decent item. There's a lot of work on the front end, to be honest, but you may be able to use this item later on in many different settings for many different years, depending on how it performs. Second, multiple choice items are not easy to write, which kind of relates back to the first point. To me, those 2 points are actually the same. Third, multiple choice items don't really allow for any creative or unique responses. So test takers don't typically have the choice to add anything more or to show that they know beyond what is presented in the individual item. They're kind of out of luck in regards to that. And fourth, your test takers may know more than you, so although a person who designs a test may believe that their one correct answer is true, a test taker may indeed find something about every alternative, including the correct one that is flawed. Now, that's assuming that, especially the fourth disadvantage, that's assuming that we're dealing with the traditional version of a multiple choice item where only one is correct. There are a number of other versions of multiple choice items that you maybe should be familiar with. The first one is the best answer multiple choice item. For this one, these are multiple choice items for which there may be more than one correct answer, but only one of them is going to be the best of all the correct answers. Second one is rearrangement multiple choice items, where the test taker arranges a set of items in a sequential order, be it steps in the process or a temporal sequence or something that might have occurred or should occur. Third one is interpretive. Over here, the test taker reads through a passage and then selects a response where the alternatives and the correct answer are all based on the same passage. And the fourth one is substitution multiple choice items. So this is something like short answer completion items basically, but there are alternatives for your test taker to choose from. Typically, the test taker will select a set of responses for the one that he or she thinks answers the question correctly. So there are many different versions essentially of multiple choice items. The hardest ones typically are going to be the best answer of multiple choice items. Okay, so you've got your multiple choice items created. You understand very well the advantages and disadvantages of multiple choice items. Now it's time to figure out if the questions that you've created are working as it should when you administer them with a bunch of test takers. So nice thing about multiple choice items is that they allow for an in-depth analysis of whether the item did what it was supposed to. That is to discriminate between those who know the material and those who do not. Now, this can be done with the completion of an item analysis, which consists of generating two different indexes for each item, the difficulty index and the discrimination index. To start, we first need to rank order the total scores from highest to lowest, right? So we're talking about not just for one item, but just a total score. And then total score for all the items, basically. And then we're going to select the top 27% of scores and identify them as the high group. And then we're going to select the bottom 27% of scores and identify them as the low group. Sometimes we may split this into a 50-50 distribution, so top 50% versus bottom 50%, maybe because of a small sample size. For the example in this slide, we'll assume that we took the top 20% of the high group and the bottom 20% and designated them as the low group. Note here in this example that this is slightly different from the example in your textbook on page 165. Um, so now that we have designated who our high groups are and low groups are, let's let's take a look at one item at a time. So not the entire test. So an item, remember, this is an item analysis. Say for example, we pick to do an item analysis on item number 14. Um, we'll come back again to this table in just a little bit. These are the four alternatives, A, B, C, and D. That asterisk indicates that this is the correct item. So we can see here, for example, that in terms of the people in the high group, which totals up to 25, 21 of them actually got B correct. And in the low group, out of the 25 in the low group over here, about 5 of them picked B. And this is the total of all the people that's included in the sample, the top 50, the top 20% and the bottom 20%, which is 50 people, 50 responses. So let's calculate the difficulty index. The difficulty index tells us the proportion of people who got that item correct. Generally, the lower the percentage, the harder the item, right? That should make sense. The lower the percentage of people, or the lower proportion of people who got the item correct, the harder that item is. And the higher the percentage, the easier the item. And here is the formula where uppercase D, or difficulty level, because discrimination level is going to be lowercase d. So remember, uppercase D is difficulty level, or the difficulty index. Difficulty index is defined by open parentheses, uppercase letter N, and subscript H over here. This represents the number of correct responses in the high group, plus the number of correct responses in the low group, close parentheses, divided by the total number of responses to items in the high and low group. For the exam, you definitely want to know and remember what these symbols mean. So uppercase N with subscript H, uppercase N with subscript L, and big T and big D. So in this example, T, or total number of responses from your high and low group, is 50. 21 would be the number of correct responses in the high group, and 5 is the correct responses in the low group. Right? So if we go back to this again, 21 and 5, and the total number is 50 right here. So 21 plus 5 divided by 50, that gives you 0.52, or you can interpret that as a percentage as well. So 52% of the responses to item number 14 were correct. If the difficulty level equal to 100%, that means that everyone got the item correct. That's a far too easy item. On the other hand, the other extreme of the spectrum, if the difficulty level was 0%, that meant that everyone got the item incorrect. That's a really, really super difficult item. So the percentage, again, gives you a sense of what is the proportion of test takers in your high and low group that got it correct. And that's the story of the difficulty index, capital D. Let's move on to discrimination index, a different but related type of index that is also important. So what is the discrimination index? The discrimination index is a measure of how effectively an item discriminates between your high and low groups. It is expressed as a decimal and ranges from 0, from no discrimination, to 1, perfect discrimination. You gotta remember, when lowercase d, or when the discrimination index is positive, that means more people in the high group than in the low group got the item correct. When d is negative, it means that more people in the low group than in the high group got the item correct. That's not a good thing, because you would assume that people in the high group know the answer, and if the people in the high group are not getting the item correct, and you have people in the low group getting the items correct, then there's something wrong with your item, basically. And your item is not doing a really good job of discriminating between people who know the stuff and people who don't know the stuff. So in terms of the exam, you want to know what the discrimination index is, how to interpret it, pay attention to the signage and what the range is, and especially what it means when your discrimination index is a negative. That means that's a no-no. That's bad news. So here's the formula to calculate discrimination index. Lowercase d equals to number of correct responses minus number of correct responses in the low group divided by half of the total number of responses for the high and low group. So if you plug the numbers into the above formula, that's basically 21 minus 5 divided by 25, which is half of 50. You get 0.64. So 0.64 is the discrimination index, so it's positive 0.64. Given that it is positive, we can interpret this as more people in the high group than in the low group got the item correct. That means your item is doing what it should. If d is negative, if lowercase d is negative, it means that more people in the low group than in the high group got the item correct. That means that your item is not doing what it should. So let's talk about extreme types of cases. Let's talk about the perfect item, right? So the perfect item has two characteristics. First, the item is sufficiently difficult that 50% of all the test takers get it correct and 50% of all the test takers get it incorrect. So that's capitalized D, 50%. So second of all, if you look at discrimination level, you basically want all of the test takers in your highest scoring group to get the item correct. That is lowercase d equals to 1. And you want all the test takers in the low scoring group to get the item incorrect. Again, that is also indicated by lowercase d equals to 1. So in terms of the perfect item, half of the test takers got the item correct, and all of those who got the item correct, all of them basically came from your high group. So in terms of the exam, you definitely want to know what are the characteristics of the perfect item. That is uppercase D, 50%, and lowercase d equals to 1.0. Now, just elaborating a little bit more about the relationship between difficulty level and discrimination level. Now, a very important thing about the relationship between these concepts is that the difficulty level on the x-axis over here very much constrains the upper limit of your discrimination level, as shown by these dotted lines over here. So here's a visual representation of the constraining effects of item difficulty on discrimination level. So notice that as difficulty deviates from 50%, right, as it goes larger or smaller, the discrimination level or the upper limit of the discrimination level decreases, as shown over here by these dotted lines. So, for example, if your difficulty level is 50%, then your discrimination level is maximized at 1. But say, we have item 3 over here, for example, who has a difficulty level of 75% on the x-axis. You can see that the upper limit, the best that we can expect in terms of the discrimination level, given that it's here and not here, it's going to be at most negative 0.5. Now, if this item was over here, then the maximum that it's going to get, if you draw that line, is going to be positive 0.5. That's about as best as the discrimination level that you can get, as best or as worst, I guess. So we got to remember that the discrimination level is very much constrained by the difficulty level based on this graph here, as shown here on this graph. So here's a little exercise for you to practice your uppercase D and lowercase d interpretation. Let's say we have items 1, 2, 3, and 4, and these are their positions on this two-dimensional plane where you have difficulty level on the x-axis and discrimination level on the y-axis. How is item 1 doing right here? Well, item 1 appears to have a difficulty level of about 25%. This means that about 25% of the test takers got it correctly. That means that's a pretty hard test. Most of all the test takers got it wrong. Item 1 also appears to have a positive discrimination level of about 0.50. This means that the high ability group did better compared to the low ability group. So of those who did get it correct, most of them came from your high ability group. Let's take a look at item 2. So item 2 appears to have a difficulty level of 75%. This means that 75% of the majority of the test takers got this correctly. This means that this was also a pretty easy test. It also has a positive discrimination level of 0.50. This means that the item is doing what it is supposed to be doing, whereby most of the people who got this right came from the high group or the high ability group. What about item 3? Well, item 3 has a difficulty level of 75%. So it is a fairly easy item, just like item 2, but a negative discrimination level. That means more of the low ability people were getting this item right. So that's pretty much the complete opposite of what you would expect. Item 4 is not doing really well either. It is a pretty hard test given the difficulty level, given that only 25% of people got it correct. But the people who are getting it correct were people in the low group, as evidenced by the negative signage of the discrimination level. So in your exam and also for the assignment, you will be given the task basically of trying to calculate the difficulty and discrimination indices. Definitely in the third quarterly assignment, in the very first question, you're going to be given a table that is very similar to this, and you're going to be asked to calculate the difficulty and discrimination indices. So be sure that you know how to calculate them both and to provide the appropriate interpretations for them. So there you have it. That's chapter 9. We talked about guidelines for writing multiple choice items. We talked about the pros and cons of multiple choice items. And importantly, we talked about item analysis. Specifically, that can be described in terms of the discrimination index, the difficulty index, and there's a very close relationship between how one affects the other, specifically how difficulty constrains the upper or lower limit of your discrimination index. So that's pretty much it for this lecture. There are also videos for your third quarterly assignment. Be sure to watch those things too. And let me know if you have questions with anything pertaining to this chapter or the assignment or the exam.